That's a good one.
Yeah, that's what we need to
Although what happens if I add Rome on there?
That's it.
There is a flow to history and culture. This flow is rooted in what people think, and what they think will determine how they act.
There is violence and a breakdown in society up to the point in which it's unsafe to walk through the streets in many of the cities of the world. On the other hand, there is a danger of an increasing authoritarianism to meet the threat of chaos in our own countries and internationally. Should we despair and give in? If not, how should we then live? The answer as to whether we should throw up our hands and give in is no. There are good and sufficient reasons for this. We can receive help from a quarter, which would be unexpected to most modern men. But to understand how, we have to delve back into history. I will begin with the time of the Romans, because the Roman civilization is the direct ancestor of the modern European world. From the time of the earliest conquests under the Republic, right down to our own day, Roman law and Roman political ideas have influenced the European scene, the whole Western civilization. The Roman Empire was great, both in size and military strength. It reached out over much of the known world. Its roads led over all of Europe, the Near East, and North Africa. All the way from Hadrian's Wall, which was built to keep out the Scots, who were too tough to conquer, to the forts on the Rhine River, to the north of Africa, to the Euphrates River, and the Caspian Sea. In one conquest, the Roman legions crossed the Alps, came down the Rhone Valley past the peaks of the Dolomiti to that place which is now called Vevey in Switzerland. For a time, the Helvetians, the principal inhabitants of Switzerland, held them in check and made the proud Romans pass under the yoke, ironically imitating the custom of the Romans, who had the warriors they conquered pass under a yoke. This was a temporary reversal. Not much could hold back the Roman legions, neither difficult terrain nor the armies of their enemies. They passed up over the hills and conquered the ancient Helvetian capital, Aventicum, today called Avanches. One can imagine a Roman legionnaire who slogged home from the vastness of the north. As he mounted the hill and looked down on Avanches, a little Rome as it were, with its amphitheater, its theater, and its temples,
I love Avanches. It contains some of my favorite Roman ruins north of the Alps. Some have said, although I think it's a high figure, that at one time 40,000 Romans lived here. The opulence of Rome was here at Avanches. This gold bust of Marcus Aurelius was found here. Rome left its magnificent treasures in art and architecture across the whole empire. In many ways, Rome was great, but it had no real answers to the basic problems that all humanity faces. When a culture tries to build only on its military strength, very, very soon, these will prove not to be sufficient, for the simple reason that without a sufficient base of knowing what is right, what is wrong, why we should do certain things in contrast to why we should do certain others, no amount of military might is sufficient. Rome first tried to build upon the decisions of accepted citizens of the Republic, and later on the decisions of its emperors. But the attempt ultimately failed, because it was not a sufficient base on which to build a society. And they never had the kind of democracy we have, where everybody shares in it. But for those who were the real citizens of the state, they just tried to build on their opinions, and this totally failed. And then they turned to their gods. This is the goddess Diana, whose temple was in Ephesus, which is in modern Turkey. The Romans, like the Greeks before them, also tried to build upon their gods in the hope of having something big enough upon which to rest their society. But their gods were not big enough because they were finite. That is, they were limited. They were like bigger men and women, not basically different from human men and women. They were amplified humanity, not divinity. This being so, the Romans had no sufficient base intellectually. That is, they did not have anything big enough or permanent enough to which to relate either their thinking or their life. Therefore, they had no value system strong enough to bear the strains of life, either individual or political. All their gods together could not give them a sufficient base for life, morals, values, or final decisions. The Romans made their own gods depending upon their society, and when the society tumbled, their gods tumbled with them. Thus, the Roman experiment in social harmony, based on an elitist republic, ultimately failed. The Senate no longer could keep order. Armed gangs terrorized the city of Rome, and the normal functions of government were disrupted as rivals fought for power. Self-interest took the place of social interest, no matter how sophisticated the trappings. Thus, in desperation, the people accepted authoritarian government. In the days of Julius Caesar, Rome turned to an authoritarian system centered in Caesar himself. As Plutarch put it, the Romans made Caesar dictator for life,
in the hope that the government of a single person would give them time to breathe after so many civil wars and calamities. This was indeed a tyranny avowed, since his power now was not only absolute, but perpetual too. After Caesar's death, Octavian, later called Caesar Augustus, grandnephew of Caesar, came to power. The great Roman poet Virgil, friend of Augustus, wrote in his Aeneid, saying that Augustus was a divinely appointed leader, and that Rome's mission was to bring peace and civilization to the world. Because Augustus offered external and internal peace, while keeping the outward forms of legal constitutionality, Romans of every class were ready to allow him total power in order to restore and assure the functioning of the political system, of business, and the affairs of daily life. After 12 BC, he became the head of the state religion with the title Pontifex Maximus. All men were urged to worship the spirit of Rome and the genius of the emperor. Later, this became obligatory for all the people of the empire. And later still, the emperors simply ruled as gods. Augustus tried to legislate morals and family life. Later emperors tried impressive legal reforms and welfare programs. But a human god was a poor foundation, and Rome fell. It is important to realize the difference a people's worldview makes to their strength as they're exposed to the pressures of life. In the Roman era, we must understand that when one became a Christian, it meant that he stood not only opposed to the surrounding religions, but the entire culture built on those religions. Back in the Roman days, when a person became a Christian and was marked as a Christian by baptism, it was a very short step at times from the open profession of faith to the martyr's death. Rome was cruel, and its cruelty could perhaps be best pictured by the events which took place in the Roman arenas. For example, the gladiator once sees in this statue. Or the Christians thrown to the beasts as people watched. Let us not forget why the Christians were killed. They were not killed because they worshiped Jesus. At that time, many religions were practiced in the Roman world. Some were called the mystery religions. Here, for example, we can see one of the initiatory rites practiced by one of these religions depicted in this Roman house in Pompeii. Nobody cared who worshipped whom, as long as the unity of the state was maintained, centered in the worship of the emperor. The Christians were killed because they were rebels, and this was especially so as they lost the support of the Jewish synagogues, and therefore the immunity which the Jews had since the time of Caesar. We may express the nature of this rebellion in two ways, both of which are true. We can say they worship Jesus as God, and they worship the personal, infinite God only. This worshiping of the one God only, Caesar could not tolerate. It was counted as treason. This became a special threat to the unity of the state based on emperor worship during the reign of Diocletian in the 3rd century, when people of the higher classes began to become Christians in larger numbers. In the Roman era, when one became a Christian, it meant that he stood not only opposed
to the surrounding religions, but the entire culture built on those religions. The early church believed that Jesus was the Old Testament prophesied Messiah, and that he had come, and that he had died in substitution on the cross. The second thing, however, is something that we're apt to forget, and that is that they really did believe that the Old Testament and the revelation in Christ and the growing New Testament, it was growing then, of course, say the first century, was God who had spoken, and that God had given truth. And as such, they were not caught in the flux of the relativistic Roman world, because it really was relativistic, much like our own day.
A weak base for a culture or an individual can only stand when the pressures are not too great. As an illustration, let us take this bridge. The Romans built many little humpback bridges like this over the streams of Europe. People and wagons went over them safely for centuries, for 2 millennia. But now, if someone would drive a heavily loaded truck over these, they would break. It is this way with the lives and value systems of individuals and cultures. If they have nothing stronger to build upon than their own finiteness, their own limitedness, they can stand if the pressures are not too great. But as the pressures mount, if they do not have a sufficient base, they crash. Just as these Roman bridges would crash if someone drove over them with a modern 10-ton truck. Culture and the freedoms of men are fragile. If there's not a sufficient base, it only takes time, and often not a great deal of time, before there is a collapse. In catacombs such as these here in Rome, the Christians buried their dead and met for worship. That it was the Christians who were able to resist the religious mixtures, syncretism, and the effects of the weaknesses of Roman culture speaks of the strength of the Christian worldview. This strength rested on God being an infinite personal God, and that he had spoken in the Old Testament, the revelation through Christ, and the gradually growing New Testament, and that he had spoken in a way that people could understand. This meant that they not only had knowledge about the universe and mankind, which people could not find out by themselves, but they had absolute universal values by which to live and by which to judge the state in which they lived. And people are unique in being made in the image of God. There was a reason for the basic dignity and value of each individual. If they had worshipped Jesus and Caesar, they would have gone unharmed. But they worshipped one God only and rejected all forms of syncretism. There was no mixture. All other gods were seen as false gods. Or we can express why they were killed in another way. No totalitarian authority, no authoritarian state can tolerate those who have an absolute by which to judge that state and its actions. The Christians had a universal standard by which to judge not only personal morals, but the state. So they were counted as the enemy of totalitarian Rome.
even though many of the Christians were martyred, they had the answer, which the Romans did not have, as the Romans tried to build upon the state or upon their limited gods. The Christians continued to grow in numbers and continued in history. The Romans had the Christian answers before them, but they turned from that base, which would have given their society the answers they needed, and their society collapsed. As their empire ground down, the Romans, in their decadence, were given to a great thirst for violence and the gratification of their senses, as in their rampant sexuality. Here in Pompeii, a century or so after the Republic had ceased to exist, the phallus cult was strong. Paintings and statuary of exaggerated sexual content adorned the houses of the affluent. Not all the art in Pompeii was like this, but that which was of sexual representation was just plain blatant. Rome collapsed, not from external, but from internal weaknesses. Even though Emperor Constantine ended the persecution of the Christians, and Christianity became a legal religion in 313 AD, and the official state religion of the empire in 381 AD, the majority of the people went on in their old ways. Apathy was the chief mark of the period. The elite abandoned intellectual life for their social life. Apathy also showed itself in the arts, with a lack of creativity. Officially sponsored art became decadent. The music became increasingly bombastic. Look at these 4th century works here on the Arch of Constantine. And in contrast, these handsome 2nd century works of art taken from earlier monuments from the period of Emperor Trajan. This portrait of Emperor Valentinian is so much inferior to this likeness of Emperor Nero, which was minted 300 years earlier. All of life was marked by the prevailing apathy. And as the Roman economy slumped lower and lower, burdened by a costly government and by inflation, authoritarianism increased in order to try to set off the apathy. And as less people were inclined to work, the state took over more and more freedoms were lost. For example, laws were passed binding the small farmer to his land. And because of the apathy and its results and the oppression, few people thought the old civilization was worth saving. Rome did not collapse because of outward forces such as the barbarians, but because of inward rottenness. And Rome gradually became a ruin. The conclusion I draw looking at the Roman era is the fact that nothing humanistic provides a strong enough base for society, as well as the individual life of the individual man and woman. The Greeks and the Romans tried magnificently to first build on society, on those people who made up their society, which is an exclusive, elitist society. But those people, they tried to build on this and totally failed. And then they tried to build on finite gods, gods that were not the infinite personal God. And this equally failed. It brings a simple conclusion. There is no foundation strong enough for society within the realm of finiteness and beginning from man alone and as autonomous. And the other side, of course, is that the Christians were able to stand. But the reason they were able to resist the syncretism of that day and the breakdown and face the arena, really face it with certainty, is because they began at exactly the opposite place. They began with the existence of an infinite personal God, and that he had spoken, and they had the truth in the Old and the Testament, in the revelation of Christ, and in the then growing New Testament.
Camera can pick up. Can we get the
I
participants
don't
in
think
this?
so, because because the mic doesn't have range.
I see.
I'm getting rid of this one.
Please. There we go. All right. We'll do something about that at another time then. Going to the questions section, how much time do we have? About 10 minutes, 15?
Right.
So, were y'all following along in the outline?
I was fascinated with the pictures.
There are no pictures in this book, sorry. But you were quite taken with the Knickerbockers, weren't you?
Oh, yeah.
Well, one quick thing before you get started.
Yeah.
I will give extra credit to anybody that can identify the car that he was riding in.
I know it, but I don't remember the name, but yeah.
I want to know who was riding along beside of him filming it. I'm gonna get to that quick.
So what were some of the things that kind of called out? We'll go through the questions here, but just very quickly, like one or two things that kind of stood out to you in the,
Nears 2020. Yes, I think we're in that. And also the artwork was magnificent.
so we have, okay. And then we'll say as an extension of that, artwork.
Well, it was magnificent.
The artwork was magnificent. So that's a little different than what I was thinking.
Well, I mean, the statues, even the gods were beautiful.
He showed you there too also that the artwork at the beginning was magnificently done. And as Rome went down the slope, so did the artwork, and you can bring that back to present day too. Some of the artwork, it's so-called artwork. It's, remember when the guy ate the banana?
Yeah.
It was such a it was a banana on display. Some of it was supposed to be beautiful art. Because somebody bought it for so many thousands of dollars.
Right.
Somebody too many names.
We call it a modern day masterpiece.
Yeah, it actually, yeah.
What else stood out?
I like the evolution of our intelligence, I think.
Okay.
Because we're just, you can see that happening. It's groupthink, it's not education.
True.
You're not allowed to divide it.
I think the view from 30,000 feet, what he's saying here is Rome started as a republic, but it was built on a value system that was human-centered, and then it had all this problem, and the republic started to collapse. In comes a strong leader to save it, and that was the beginning of the end of Rome. Same thing with Germany. I mean, it repeats itself throughout history.
Oh, and for the same reason, what did they say? The economics, right?
Yeah, and what is the foundation of your society built on? If it's built on humanism and human gods, it'll collapse.
You can look at that, it's like Japan too. When he mentioned emperors, and I'm going to jump away here. Anything led by man that's man-centered it's gonna fail. You got to have belief in how this country was actually started on jailed Christian belief and as a base, but if you put it in a man's for us, it's gonna fail. All countries in the past have done like that.
Okay.
I thought it was interesting, he said that it didn't take an outside force to collapse Rome, it collapsed from the inside out.
One of my favorite things is, have you ever watched on TV, and I like to see it once in a while on this, they got this gigantic building, maybe 30, 40 stories tall, and they're gonna take the building down. So they don't come in with cranes to start pulling it apart. They identify the key pillars that the building rests on. They blow the pillars out, and the building collapses on itself, it self-destructs. And I always think of that, education, the church, our political system, all the key pillars, the family, the nuclear family, they're blowing them out one at a time, and America could go away, could collapse on itself.
Have you, y'all remember Paul Harvey? He did a thing about, well, if I were Satan, what would I do to undermine society and all those things? If you haven't heard that, go look up Paul Harvey and If I Were Satan or something.
Now
like
for
that.
the rest of the story.
Right. So going to the questions section, because there's a lot of discussion here, and they aren't question, yes or no question or multiple choice. They're more, well, I guess they're really kind of essay questions, right? But so we have, we'll call them discussion, but I encourage you to take notes as well. So the first one, he says, Dr. Schaefer claims that through looking at history, we can see how presuppositions determine events. Does this discussion bear this out? And if so, how? So presuppositions determine events. What are some of the presuppositions that we experience in the video?
Well, they thought Rome would be forever. Isn't that a presupposition for them? They thought this will just go on forever.
Okay.
They weren't paying attention to what was really happening. They had a blindness of what was really going on.
I think the big one is relativism. We view things as relative.
Well, we can't define truth.
Relativism, there's not a I don't know where the eraser went. Couples class members.
I'm glad you're doing that. I can't spell.
All right, what was the other somebody mentioned?
We can't define truth anymore.
Well, yeah.
It's a subset of that.
Yeah. I think the definition of truth is more, I think relativism is less important than the absolute definition of truth. It's kind of a symptom.
Well, that's your definition.
Mine is always right. Also, they thought of themselves as a highly tolerant society. They were not, because they thought, we were so tolerant of all these different religions and blah, blah, blah. But one thing they could not tolerate was individualism, and independent thought. And aren't we working our way toward that now?
That's sort of the framework of socialism, belief system.
And didn't it mention in here, didn't he mention that they didn't want to reform the society, they wanted to destroy it and rebuild it? He didn't use those words, but toward the end, I think he said something to that effect.
I heard that, what I heard was that they didn't see, or many didn't see that there was any point in rebuilding or something along those lines.
That's the apathy.
The apathy, yeah. But certainly not, I mean, that's your interpretation.
Well, no, he said something, he said it much better than I did.
He indicated that the apathy was seen in the devaluation of art, that when Rome was at its zenith, art was, as you said, the gods were pretty. They were, you know, but when it got close to the end, the art had deteriorated to the point that, you know, nothing was really outstanding in terms of the art.
And then the cruelty that came into it. That you had to have more violence. Like when you go to the movies, you've got to have. Today, you have so much sound, so much, you just wish they would stop a little bit so you catch your breath. Because there's so much movement, so much activity.
Well, you're being entertained, and what happened in Rome. So
Yeah.
they're being entertained.
And you have
Colosseums.
to keep going forward. So then it's not only on the screen, you know, when's it going to be in the arena?
Right. Right. Okay.
Oh, I picked up too, you can have the strongest army in the world, and that might, but that still is not going to secure the inner sanctum of a government.
Yeah, it'll collapse.
And so the presupposition there being a strong army.
Without you needing. You could defeat the enemy.
It struck me that they would not invade Scotland. That little tiny itty bitty place up there, but then they took over.
Well, like Trump, they had a wall there. They
Oh,
could, you know.
They tried. They did actually make incursions, and they tried. And they did make some. Who was the emperor that built the wall beyond Hadrian's Wall a couple hundred years later? I forget who it was. But anyway.
They met up with Braveheart, and he would be defeated.
Well, that wasn't Rome.
Well,
The concept, yeah. Well, they were individuals. They wouldn't.
Yeah, was he a Scotsman though? Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't put a name to Braveheart, I just said.
The
symbolic.
persona, yeah, yeah, there you go. Okay. All right, any other presuppositions?
Not exactly a presupposition, but it terrifies me when I think I couldn't go into that arena without God giving me strength. I mean,
As a spectator or as a?
No, as a participant, being food for the mind.
Mhm.
I mean, imagine our grandchildren may face that.
Possible.
We may face it. I mean, because he did say how fast it moved,
Mhm.
and we are moving very fast. And it's something to think about.
So I had, let's see, the presuppositions. So that was obviously kind of earlier presuppositions, right? A lot of these. And then somebody tell me, because they showed this on here. Somebody tell me, what does this stand for? SPQR.
Senate, the people, and, I forget the.
It's
Senate-
Latin.
The Republic.
Yeah, yeah, Senate, people, and Republic.
It's also a great restaurant in New York City.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, well,
down a little
there
Italy.
you
That's
Yeah,
good.
they're close.
It's not funny, but it's funny, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, so, but that was during the time of the Republic. They kind of kept that for many, into the empire, but increasingly less important. So some things to consider there. Let's see. Sorry, they didn't give a lot of space for writing notes, so I'm kind of pecking through here a little bit. So what did they say about, so when they moved to the period of empire, obviously they were very tolerant of everybody as long as you did what they told you to. So how then did Christians not, how were they sort of,
They were rebels.
why were they rebels? How
They
were they
wouldn't
rebels?
Because
worship
they wouldn't want.
Caesar or the government of Rome.
They would not bend the knee to
They
Rome.
only worship God.
They wouldn't bow. But I would think that they were law-abiding citizens up to that point. I imagine they paid their taxes.
And kept their masks on and kept their social.
Right, but
distancing.
the emperor is God, right? So-
Right, but I
They
mean,
So therefore,
yeah, but they
The
wouldn't,
one thing they wouldn't do was honor and revere Caesar.
where are we maybe seeing that played out today? That wasn't one of my
Churches.
questions. Maybe,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
anything,
Well, you got, we welcome all the homosexuals and the same sex marriage and all that, and God loves you, and people eat that up. Come on in, and once you say Jesus is Lord and what you're doing is wrong, and I'm not saying that because I think it's wrong, God thinks it, you're insulting God. Just like he said there, as long as the Christian could have got along in a room for 1,000 years if it lasts that long, as long as, well, everybody's welcome. There's no God. And that's what's from the pulpit, it's still being absence of truth, yeah, everything's wrong. Right?
In California, John, did you read about John MacArthur's church?
Yes.
Okay, and the governor of California is in a war against that church.
Mhm.
And he threatens if they don't comply by stop meeting together, he's gonna shut off their power, shut off their electricity. There's a contract, right, John, for a parking lot, and they're gonna null and void that contract.
They already
So-
voided it.
The state is assuming a higher authority over the church.
Right.
And demanding that the church submits to the authority of the state, as represented by that dummy they elected as a governor.
There's another church out there that's been fined $50,000 or something because of the
1,000 a day.
services. Not MacArthur's church, but another one.
Another one,
Well, they're
1,000
trying
others.
to,
Yeah,
yeah, there's another guy, but MacArthur's church, they're trying to fine him $1,000 a day. So he's been to court 4 times, with his lawyers. And
So
they
what-
have a stay of injunction against the state right now, but that's only temporary.
right. So what are some of the religions that we see today then? So we saw that in Rome, they had these humanist religions, or what did he say that the amplified humanity but not divinity with the Greek and Roman gods. So, I mean, I've always said that if man were to come up, that God has to be, that the God of Scripture has to be the real true God, because surely nothing would come from the imagination of man. If, the perfect God in man's imagination would be these Greek and Roman gods, right? In all of their fallenness. What would we kind of say are religions today that
Climate change, too.
climate change? Yeah.
well, we have the Muslim and the Buddhist and all that. And also there's Satan worship too.
There is, but I take that one step further. So those are defined religions or organized religions in
Right.
some way. I guess the Satan Church maybe would consider itself organized in some sense. But what's that bumper sticker that comes on? It comes standard with every Subaru.
Coexist.
There you go.
yeah.
Sorry, Dennis. Yes, it does. That and an Apple sticker. You bought yours used. They kept it.
Environmentalism is starting to become a religion.
Well, that's the climate change sort of thing. Yeah.
If you don't believe that, you're considered a denier.
Right.
You're
So
not
you're bending the
orthodox.
knee to these things.
Well, racism also too is becoming very prevalent, depending on who defines it.
What if John MacArthur's church were to say, oh, well, we're going to be diverse and we're going to accept the homosexuals and women preachers and this sort of thing? And
Hunky dory, yeah.
you think
I mean,
it would be an
but-
interesting,
but-
you know?
Yeah, what I mean is with the guy, the governor out there going to find him, oh, yeah. Well,
Right.
you saw the light. What's that thing you gotta get, what is it, get with history or no, what is, there's a saying, it's popular.
The line is-
Right side of
The
history.
right side of history, yeah, that's.
If it were a black church, the governor wouldn't touch it with a stick. It's true.
Another religion is abortion.
Right.
Yeah.
That is now a religion, that
Right.
they worship at the altar of,
Just a-
abortion. That is something that's.
What is that, at all of these, and thinking through them, what are all of these, and he talked about this, what are all of these sort of examples of?
Humanism.
Humanism, but we're from the sense of a greater society.
Well, they're going to bring unity and peace.
Well, so what was he saying in the video though?
Oh,
So what did he say about society in Rome, that what was happening to them toward the end of
Oh, it was degenerating
degenerating how?
sexually.
There's violence.
That's one example, and violence was another example.
Economic.
Their culture, the music.
Right, so self-interest overtook the social interest,
Yeah.
which led to,
It led to call for a strong leader.
strong leader authoritarianism.
Does somebody save us from ourselves?
Right.
In walks Adolf or Julius Caesar, one of these guys. Then they morph into a tyrant and you've lost them.
Right, and then what happened to the authoritarian, the Caesar? What did he become? He was God,
Well,
exactly. And so-
Actually, what is his nephew?
Emperor.
Augustus.
Goebbels told Hitler, he says, he says, never in the history of time, mein Führer, has anyone been more beloved than you. Europe today, tomorrow the world. That was quote Joseph Goebbels. He was gone.
Right, right. So you mentioned, was it Japan? Somebody had mentioned
Japan
Japan
had an emperor too.
had an emperor. Well, they still do, and they still consider that
And a
emperor
god.
of God. And Thailand, I think we heard that on what's that podcast that we listened to?
Al Moore,
Al Mohler, he had mentioned that. They had this transition of,
getting back to Hitler, you want to see something tragic. Has anybody ever seen Joseph Goebbels? Beautiful, beautiful boys and girls, there's 6 of them. Beautiful young children. You want to have them too? They poison them. And they'll kill them all. That's what it come to their God. That's what it comes down to.
I can't live. There's no Germany like I know it today, and they want their kids to be raised.
we need to get in the sanctuary here.
Yes.
And then, let's see, I'm going to skip question 3, but question 2, how can a survey of Roman history in 1/2 hour be either useful or responsible? Why do we want to study
You're
history?
staring at us.
Well, it lays the groundwork for human actions, basically,
Right,
through history.
right,
You must study history to understand humanity. It's absolute. You have to study it in order to understand how depraved we really are.
And you talk about religion, that to me is becoming the religion, is to erase all history. They do not want to know. They don't, thou shalt not remember the past.
okay, well, I'll compromise with you. We'll just revise history and make it sound different. Like the 1619 project nonsense.
Grandpa used to say, and I kind of understand now, is that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
There's people who don't believe in the Holocaust. There's people walking around in Germany who deny the
Well,
Holocaust.
there's the Flat Earth Society as well.
There's
But
yeah, there is.
that's the relativism, right? But so we kind of see that. But so if you kind of think about Western civilization, though, what is Rome? If you do an analogy, what is Rome to Western civilization?
California.
It's kind of, no, I mean Rome as
Most of our legal system in that Rome is is the source of a lot of our.
sort of
law,
apparent, isn't
our
it?
society.
So why study the history of Rome? But what do you tell as a parent? What do you tell children that learn from my mistakes? Please let me help you by
Well, that's what they used to
telling me.
teach them.
Well, yeah, there's that. But yeah, so so by going back and studying the history of Rome, I mean, I think that we're kind of being able to investigate ourselves, right, and learn from their mistakes. Look at the road they went down. Do we really want to follow behind them?
But Rome wasn't all bad. I mean, look at the transportation system, the roads, and even their jurisprudence was not totally bad.
Well, no, but
It was a foundation.
right.
I've said this 1,000 times before, but I'll never forget when World War II ended. I was just a young boy, and we went to the movie. And there was, everybody remember Pathé News and March of Time. There was this Adolf Hitler. You seek his monument, look around, and then the camera passed over Germany in Rome, ruins. And you go back to the present day, and the socialism and the Democratic Party, you seek their monument, you look around. You've got Baltimore, you've got Chicago. All these cities are run by these people that are degrading into everything goes. But it is, like you said, we need history, but we forget it too soon.
And that's the purpose of this whole series. I mean, what we're discussing and listening to here, well, you won't hear this in most of our universities or high schools.
No, they won't.
It's being revised.
Yeah. And that, they know that, break the family down, break your education system down.
Schaefer's given a clarion call to wake up.
You know, it's funny, Rome kind of failed twice in a big way. First time, the Roman Empire. Then during the Second World War, El Duce was running the joint.
You know?
And Hitler actually envied him.
He made the trains run on time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then they hung him up with his
Oh, that was, I mean, just the whole, yeah.
mistress by piano wire or something.
So, well, even he had a tragic death. I mean, we're talking about the likes of Ahab here, you know, I mean, probably even a bit more so. So here's your homework for next week. Bring a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I may not have spelled that correctly, but bring a quote. Write that down, bring a quote, because I think there's a lot to be learned from some of the stuff that he has written, and a lot of it, this was done back in what, 78? 76, something like that. Somewhere right in the mid-70s. And I think somebody looking at this in the mid-70s would probably think about, well, I don't see how they wouldn't be able to connect dots, whereas I think we get to see a lot of it to more fruition now, 40 years later, than they would have seen presently. So somebody go ahead and close us in prayer, please.
Our Father and our God, indeed, maybe what we've witnessed today in this film, may it sink in and help us think. And Lord, we can't do nothing without you, because we got our communion today. Without the cross, we stand before you condemned. And may we always remember that, and no matter how bad it's going to get, and it is going to get worse. You are our Lord, and you are Savior, and we know the end, that you're going to conquer all. But give us the courage to stand for you when the time comes, and your will be done. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
I think there's an H in there, but